We're set for the biggest drop in living standards since the 1950s. We're in recession. Will higher taxes and spending cuts, the exact opposite of what we were promised 8 weeks ago, get us out of this mess? After the Chancellor's autumn statement, we'll hear live from a renter, a businessman and a carer who, like you, will be directly affected by today's tax rises and spending cuts. We'll bring you an in-depth interview with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury and ask him, are voters having to suffer for mistakes made by previous Conservative governments?
The Prime Minister and the Chancellor said that when they came in. They said mistakes were made, and within 3 days, the Chancellor corrected.
We'll also question Labour. Do they accept £55 billion worth of fiscal tightening? And if they do, how would they plug it? Good evening. Today's autumn statement was as long awaited as it was heavily trailed, and it's looking really grim. By this point in the evening, there's every chance you've already got to grips with the main announcements and headlines. In a sentence, they are £25 billion worth of tax rises, £30 billion worth of spending cuts. Millions of people will pay more in tax and more in energy bills. Benefits and pensions will rise in line with inflation. The minimum wage will go up. Public spending will grow more slowly in England, but there will be extra money for schools, the NHS and social care. There is quite a lot of information to absorb, and so tonight we're going to try to touch on a few things that might not have been headline news elsewhere. That and trying to make sense of what today's announcements mean for the economy, for the government and for all of us. Let's start with our Newsnight experts. Nick Watt, our political editor, is here, and Ben Chu, our economics editor as well. We're going to hear a lot more from you later, Ben, but tell us one thing that struck you about today.
One thing that caught my eye, Victoria, was the Office for Budget Responsibility's new forecast for net migration. So that effectively reflects the number of people coming permanently to live in the UK. And let's have a look at them here. You can see the yellow line on this chart will show the previous forecast from the OBR of what net migration will be. So you can see a very big projected slump in the pandemic and then rising up to around 140 to 150,000 a year. But now look at the new forecast, the blue line there. You can see that now it doesn't think there was a plunge in net migration during the pandemic. And look at that, it's sort of remaining around 200, 220,000 a year. So effectively, that's another 70, 80,000 people a year coming to live permanently in the UK. Now, that's good for the UK's labour force. You'll have heard businesses saying we need more migrant workers to come and fill gaps in the labour market. It's also good for the public finances. The Office of Budget Responsibility told me this revision up today, that actually boosts the public finances by around £5 billion a year by the end of the forecast. But it will be contentious as well, because this is a government which has at various times promised that net migration will fall considerably. And only a few weeks ago, Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, she said she wanted to get this down to the tens of thousands. So the message from the government's official forecaster today is that is not going to happen anytime soon.
And Nick, one thing you would take away from today, what would you say?
Well, Victoria, I think from today we can now officially pronounce, under this Prime Minister at least, the death of cakeism. That is the idea that you can make very big decisions and not worry about the consequences. Under Liz Truss, of course, that meant tax cuts with no corresponding cuts in spending. So this was the moment today when we had the funeral of cakeism.
British families make sacrifices every day to live within their means, and so too must their government, because the United Kingdom will always pay its way. Yeah.
Well, that obviously, Victoria, is going to mean far greater openness about the grimness, as you were saying, of the fiscal outlook. But it's not the end of political moves which may be designed to ensnare your political opponent. So most of those spending cuts and those tax rises, well, they are going to be happening after the general election. Labour smelt a rat. So Rachel Reeves, who's the Shadow Chancellor, she outlined what she described as 4 irresponsible steps taken by Jeremy Hunt. And this was the 4th one.
attempt to lay some so-called traps for the Labour Party. They've even had George Osborne in to advise them on how to party like it's 2010.
Thank you both for the moment. Coming up, we're going to talk live to a business owner, a renter and a carer. But first, let's hear from the government. I went to Westminster earlier this evening and spoke to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, John Glenn, and asked him why the government is raising taxes now we're in a recession.
The Chancellor has been very clear that we've taken some very difficult decisions, and what we've got to do is have stable public finances. We've got to set the conditions for growth. We've also got to support public services and be compassionate to those who are going to find this record level of inflation so challenging. And that has meant tough decisions around spending and taxes, broadly similar quantum, and that means extra taxes for some businesses, although we've protected small businesses, and also it means taking decisions on spending.
Why is it fair to make some people, like cleaners, like security guards, like part-time workers, pay tax for the very first time in the middle of a cost of living crisis? How is that fair?
We have put in a package of support to help those people who are on low incomes. The discretionary £1 billion extra we've given local authorities in the Household Support Fund will make a significant contribution. We're also putting in payments to households to help directly with their energy costs, and we're committed to do that next year as well.
Under Conservative government since 2010, there will have been 2 lots of austerity announced: weak growth, flatlining productivity. The UK is the only G7 economy not to have recovered from the pandemic in terms of the level of GDP. Biggest fall in living standards next year since records began. Why should anyone trust anything you say about the economy ever again?
We have had 4 months after a general election a pandemic that we hadn't had for 100 years.
And I'm going to pause you there, if I may, Mr. Glenn, because from 2010, we've had weak growth under consecutive Conservative governments. We've had flatlining productivity under consecutive Conservative governments.
We had a faster level of growth than most in the G7 last year. If you look at the next 2 years, we are also in a strong position to come out of this recession.
We haven't caught up with what we were before the pandemic. That is unique amongst G7 countries.
I think the combination of the impact of the pandemic on our public finances, as well as the implications of what Putin did in Ukraine in terms of the disruption to the wholesale energy market, have had an enormous impact.
Yeah, and if many other countries,
if you're going to mitigate that meaningfully, and we're putting £60 billion worth of support to help people deal with that unprecedented increase in their energy bills, that is going to be challenging. But we've also recognised that growth is the key to move forward. And therefore, we've protected R&D spending. We've put reliefs in for small businesses in business rates. And we've done a lot, too, to preserve the investment in infrastructure.
The UK's projected debt levels compared to Canada, France, the US, Japan are much lower. We're actually near the bottom of the pack. Yet you're putting taxes up and they're not. If you're being honest with our viewers, this is a political choice, isn't it? You don't have to do it like this.
Well, I think we saw during the period immediately after the mini-budget the issue of when you borrow and the markets don't respect that you have a plan. And
so that's an overt acknowledgement from this government that the mini-budget has definitely made things worse.
The Prime Minister and the Chancellor said that when they came in. They said mistakes were made, and within 3 days, the Chancellor corrected those mistakes.
So why is it fair that you are asking voters to literally pay for the mistakes of Conservative leaders?
What I was explaining, you were asking me about the profile of debt amongst similar countries. What I was explaining to you is that what we need to have is sound public finances and convince the markets that we, the British government, understand the profile of expenditures going forward and how much borrowing and debt that we're prepared to take on to get us through this crisis. But the major challenge that we face as a country and as an economy is inflation. We have got to deal with that inflation urgently.
There's also going to be a lot more immigration, an extra 70,000 migrants on top of what we already have each year. Now, some people who voted for Brexit believed that control of immigration meant it would come down not go up?
We've this year seen 140,000 people come in from the Ukraine, facing very, very difficult circumstances. But I also recognise that the pandemic has changed the workforce and the profile of people working age who are not working. And that's why today the Chancellor acknowledged that in his speech and said that we need to work with employers about how we can bring people back into the workforce.
Right. So
pressure.
Has the Chancellor had a conversation with the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who wants to bring net migration down to the tens of thousands? It's going up.
There is a real problem with the profile of the workforce and people who are not working in ways that they did prior to the pandemic.
And in the meantime, we need more net migration, yes?
Well, there will be migration for skilled people and skilled visas. The Prime Minister has recognised that that will be part of the mix, but there's a challenge to get domestic workforce working again too.
More immigration, an extended windfall tax, wealth creators being taxed more, working people paying more in tax. What is the point of a Conservative government?
If we don't grip inflation, we'll see more and more spiralling wage demands. We will see the poorest impacted most, and that's why we've taken the decisions today, a balance to try and support the most vulnerable, but also recognise that we have got to bear down on inflation so that when we do, interest rate pressure will recede, they will go down, those interest rates will go down, and that will have a positive effect on the economy.
Thank you very much for talking to Newsnight, Mr. Glenn. Thank you.
Thank you.
And if you wish to watch a longer interview with John Glenn, you'll be able to on Newsnight's social media a little later. Let's talk to Labour now. Thangam Debonair is Shadow Leader of the House and she can talk to us from Bristol. Good evening. Thank you for talking to Newsnight. We know that you say that Labour wouldn't have started from here, but given where we are, what would Labour have done differently today?
I think we can't ignore the wouldn't have started from here part of it, I'm afraid, Victoria, because, a few weeks ago, nobody was talking about spending cuts. This has come about because of the disastrous mini-budget by Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, and added to the last 12 weeks of chaos, the 12 years of Tory economic mismanagement. They didn't just fail to mend the roof while the sun was shining to protect us from hard times and inflation and other global pressures. They've actually blew the roof off. And that means that working people are left paying the price. Pensioners are going to be cold. There will be families who are struggling to choose between heating and eating. And we didn't really see any solution today with a plan for growth. Labour would, and the Tories could have, put out a proper plan for growth. We would like to see a proper plan for growth. We've got one, and we would like to see that this country's economy booming so that we can invest in our public services, so that we can make sure that our children do have a genuinely good future.
We did see the triple lock for pensioners, state pensions rising in line with inflation. We did see help continuing when it comes to energy bills for the most vulnerable. We know from your Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Pat McFadden, that you accept the OBR's figures of this gap of 55 billion. If you win the next election, you too are going to have to make decisions about tax rises and spending cuts.
Well, it depends just how utterly badly the Tories mismanage the economy over the next 2 years. And when it comes to the next general election, the question for the voters will be, is my family better off or worse off under the Tories? And at the moment,
do you accept, Thangam Debonair, that you will have to make, if you win the election, decisions about spending cuts and or tax rises?
Every government has to make decisions about taxes and spending. That is the job of government. And it's important that we focus on making a proper plan for growth. This Tory government has not put forward a sustainable plan for growth. We would be investing in those renewable energy systems so that there will be good jobs around the country, that are the jobs of the future, making sure that the capabilities and the skills of people up and down this fantastic country are equipping us to be the world beaters in wind, in solar, in tidal, that are going to help reduce our dependency on oil and gas, that will help save our planet and will help keep our homes warm. There's any number of things the government could do and we would do. And when we get into government, which I hope will be soon, Those are the things that we'll be focusing on, is making sure we grow our economy so we can pay for the public services people need, whereas at the moment they're being asked to pay more for less and less.
The policies you have out there already that we can look at numbers on include getting rid of the non-dom status, which would raise £3.2 billion. The windfall tax, your windfall tax, is around £8 billion, I understand. Getting rid of the tax break on the bonuses of private equity managers, I can't find a figure for. How much would that raise?
Well, I don't have that figure in front of me right now, but it's certainly one of the things we would be doing, because it's reasonable to assume that with those three things as they are thus far, that is way off reaching 55 billion, correct? And by the time we get to the next general election, the situation will be even more complicated still. So making promises right now for what we do in 2 years' time would be irresponsible. But I can tell you, and I can tell people watching, that we will make no promises in our manifesto that aren't fully funded and fully costed, that we will have strict fiscal rules. Rachel Reeves has set out for a long time that we would have those fiscal rules, you know, getting debt falling as a share of GDP and making sure that we're not borrowing for day-to-day spending, because we know that we are spending the British people's money. And frankly, at the moment, they don't have a lot of it. And they're having to make do and try and match up their incomes, which have been falling under the Tories, to the rising prices. That's happened under the Tories' watch. It isn't all about the last 12 weeks. That's just made it markedly worse.
One final question. We've just heard the Chief Secretary to the Treasury accepting that net migration is going to go up. Would a Labour government do anything to stop that?
Well, I think this is an admission of their own failure to take notice of the gaps in our workforce. We've had a workforce problem, for instance, in the NHS for years now. And that's one of the reasons why there are still lots of people unable to work at the moment. The government talked today about getting people back into work, but they have no proper plan for NHS workforce. And that's one of the things that scrapping the non-dom tax status would help to pay for, so that we can make sure that we are growing our own workforce. We are deeply grateful to people who come here to contribute their skills and their knowledge, but it's also unethical to expect other countries, often poorer countries, to put in the expense of training staff only for us to just import them to fill in the gaps in our own workforce, because the government has failed to make a proper plan. Labour has a proper plan. We know that NHS staff are on their knees working as hard as they can, just to pick one industry that is badly understaffed. And we are coming. We want those NHS workers to know the cavalry is coming. There is a Labour government with a plan for how to pay for the increase in the workforce that we will need.
Thank you very much for joining us this evening on Newsnight. Thank you. Let's talk to three people now who are all affected by today's autumn statement in different ways. Caitlin Hurley spends 40% of her income on rent. She's a member of the Labour Party. She's a representative for the Acorn Community Union, which campaigns for housing rights. Richard Walker is the managing director of supermarket chain Iceland and is an approved Conservative candidate. And Beverly Campbell has no political affiliation. She's from the Family Rights Group, which supports parents and kinship carers. And she is also a carer for her own 98-year-old grandma. Welcome, all of you. Richard Walker, first of all, households and businesses are still trying to digest how today's statement affects them. I wonder, can you put a figure on it as the MD of Iceland?
In terms of the effect on our consumers, look...
On your business, actually?
On our business. I think the business rate relief is very welcome. There is a structural issue with the UK high streets in terms of business rates, and actually there is a bit of welcome relief in terms of the mechanisms, the timings, the multiplier, and that will help bricks and mortar shops such as ourselves, because we're competing with online retailers.
What about the freezing of the threshold when it comes to national insurance contributions?
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, that's
a tax rise.
Yeah, that effectively is a tax rise, a tax hit. We're still making the calculations. We also have to look at the energy cap freeze as well. You can imagine the amount of fridges and freezers that we have, so you know, it's not going to get any easier.
That help's going to end, it looks like, from April in terms of energy bills.
Yeah, potentially. And what we need as a business, obviously, is cost certainty, so that we can plan and invest and open more shops and create more employment and ultimately pay more tax. You know, that's what we need. So yeah, as much support as we can, obviously, but within, you know, the realms of fiscal responsibility.
But I wonder, when you look at the freezing of the threshold when it comes to national insurance contributions from employers, the energy bill help is probably going to come to an end for companies like yours. You've got the minimum wage going up. Presumably that's going to affect you as well. I mean, how much is all that going to affect your bottom line?
Immensely. I mean, you know, we won't make a profit this year, but I actually think it's incumbent on businesses to step up, to do what they can. We're working day and night to help our customers, 5 million customers a week. We serve some of the most impoverished communities around the UK, and actually they're reliant on us to provide the absolute best value. So some of the products we sell now are loss leaders. We don't make money, and we are accepting a kind of new reality, temporarily, hopefully, of lower profit. But I think it's the right thing to do, and obviously, you know, we're positioning ourselves for the future and hopeful that in the long term it'll serve benefit. But yeah, undoubtedly hard times ahead. But it's not entirely incumbent on government to solve this. You know, it's reliant on business to step up and help consumers as well.
Beverly, welcome. You work with kinship carers. Just briefly explain to our audience, for those who want to learn more, what that means.
Well, we provide advice for parents as well as kinship carers, and basically kinship carers are family and friends who step in and take over the care of a child who may not be able to safely live at home.
What are the consequences for those carers when we get announcements such as we have today?
The difficulty is that lots of our kinship carers, or relatives, lots of them are grandparents or aunts and uncles, and they can be of an older generation. So that means that if they're taking on a younger child, they may own their own properties, they may have savings, which means that they're not going to be entitled to some of the support that local authorities might give to other people. And that means that they are then using their nest eggs and their savings to care for children. And
but if they are better off compared to others, isn't that fair?
Well, it's not necessarily better off, because some people, if you get a young child, are required to give up work, even if they're of the age to work, in order to look after that child, many of whom have had early life trauma. So they're required to give up their time, stay at home with that child, secure that child in their home. So if they're not able to work and they're then not able to support themselves on what they are getting, then they lose out twofold.
Right. And if they can't look after those kids, they will what, go into the care system?
Well, the difficulty is lots of those children are saved from the care system by their relatives and friends taking over their care. Yeah. We're getting calls to our national advice line on a daily basis of people saying, I can't continue to do this. Now, that is traumatic for a child that has been saved and lives happily and comfortably with a family or friend that they are aware of and have known for the majority of their lives. And people are choosing, some people, to practically starve rather than give up those children. But in certain cases, they will have to.
But when you say they are choosing to practically starve, what do you mean?
If a child is living with a family member and they feel that they cannot afford to keep that child there, if the local authority are unable to provide them with any further assistance because they just don't meet the criteria, some people are having to end their placements, which means going to the local authority and saying they would have to bring this placement to the end. If the child can't safely return home, the only option would be placing them with stranger foster carers. Okay. And it's not a choice that anybody would want to make, but we are speaking to foster carers and family and friends carers on a daily basis saying, we can't afford to do this. Our mortgage has gone up, our heating's gone up. We love these children desperately, but we can't keep them here and see them suffer.
Caitlin, you spend 40% of what you earn on rent. Your wages haven't kept up with inflation. Have you worked out if you are going to be paying more tax as a result of today?
Have I? That's a difficult question. I know that in the autumn statement there have been freezes in income tax and wages,
in the thresholds, yeah.
In thresholds, and whether or not my wages go up, there's a chance that because those thresholds are going to stay the same, I will be paying more of my income, which is already below the national average, in tax, and that's not an expense that I can foresee myself being able to afford, certainly on my current wage, and certainly in any sort of perceived increases in my wages.
So what will that mean for you in practical terms? What is is there anywhere that can give?
Is there anywhere that can give? I mean, like so many other renters across the country, I mean, I'm a member of Acorn, the community union, and I see renters in incredibly dire situations with months of rent arrears, being threatened with eviction, in far worse off situations than my own. And so many of us are struggling with the cost of living. We are cutting back on the food that we are eating. We are turning off the heating. I mean, dental care is one of the expenses that I've struggled to afford recently. It's been a massive, massive lifestyle change for so many ordinary people, considering that housing costs and now skyrocketing energy costs are so much of people's incomes, and so many people don't earn very much at the minute. Wages have stagnated for so long, and the government aren't doing very much to help.
Well, there's been a massive energy help package, hasn't there? And cost of living payments or payments to help with the cost of living for those on the very lowest incomes. Do you accept it's tough for landlords at the moment as well, because mortgage rates have gone up?
So mortgage rates have gone up, and I understand that repossessions are a real concern for owner-occupiers. However, I'm not a landlord, I'm a renter, and 40% of my income does go to my landlord, who profits off that income. And certainly, when we think of the cost of living crisis, there is an inequality in which it impacts people in the way that those with more wealth bear less of the cost, and those on ordinary incomes and those in poverty are struggling immensely, are choosing between heating and eating, are cutting back on leisure activities, and now cutting back on essential things that they need to live.
Thank you all very much for talking to us on Newsnight. Beverly and Caitlin and Richard, thank you very much. Thank you. Right, let's talk to Nick Watt again about the significance of what was announced by Jeremy Hunt today. Nick, what would you say?
Well, Victoria, I think we can look at today in 4 really big ways. So just let's look at this. So, in the first place, what exactly is Jeremy Hunt doing? Is Tory disunity on hold? Where do the Conservatives go from here? And then let's just think of that B word. So in the first place, what is Jeremy Hunt doing? Well, shouldn't forget that at that very basic point, he's actually following what Liz Truss wanted to do, because as Prime Minister, she said that about now we would be having planned to be reducing debt as a share of GDP. But as one of the Chancellor's aides told me, in his plan, these sums actually add up, unlike the Truss-Kwarteng plan. So today was about, in the Chancellor and the Prime Minister's eyes, clearing up the Truss-Kwarteng mess and restoring credibility with the markets with those plans for tax rises and spending cuts. Let's look at the second idea. Is Tory disunity on hold? Now, we do know that this is a very, very divided party, but today there was warmth for Jeremy Hunt from across the party. We had David Davis and Theresa May singing very similar tunes today. And on the right, today it was a muted response, but we did get an idea of the unease on the right over these tax rises last night from Jacob Rees-Mogg, when he talked about how is it a good idea to be raising taxes during a recession? I caught up with Dame Andrea Leadsom, and she had a very careful answer to Jacob Rees-Mogg.
I completely agree with Jacob that you do not want to be raising taxes into a recession. But what you'll see when you look at the timing of what the Chancellor is proposing, the OBR, this Independent Office for Budget Responsibility, has said that the prospects for inflation are that it's significantly lower by next spring. I think the Bank of England have also confirmed that that's their expectation too. And so what we'll see is inflation reducing, and yes, we will see a recession, but measures today, again, the OBR says, will lessen and shorten that recession. But there will be pain to come, but that will be slightly further out as the economy is recovering.
So, Kirsty, the third theme.
Victoria.
I'm sorry, Victoria.
Don't worry.
Where do the
poor woman's Kirsty.
Where do the Tories go from here? We could be 18 months away from an election, so there's a lot to play for. But today does mark a departure from one of the fundamental Tory offerings to the British people at the last general election, and that was Boris Johnson's "Don't worry about spending." That was his approach. So naturally, we turn to one of the authors of that 2019 manifesto, who wonders whether Rishi Sunak may struggle to repeat another Boris Johnson tactic.
The Conservatives have done an astonishing job of continually reinventing themselves as if they're a completely new government. And that happened in 2019. It appeared as though it was a first-term government after several Conservative elections. I think this time, with the cabinet being relatively similar, and the recency of the Liz Truss budget, it's going to be very hard for Sunak and Hunt to completely divorce themselves from previous government decisions, because it is still their party and many of the same people.
So, Nick Watt calling Victoria Derbyshire. The final point, which is the B word, that's the B word that dare not speak its name, Brexit. It briefly popped up in the Chancellor's statement as he talked about the opportunities it offers. In contrast, the Office for Budget Responsibility talked about how Brexit has had a significant adverse impact on UK trade. Unsurprisingly, the SNP were very keen to talk about Brexit.
Yes, there are global factors, nobody can deny that. But Brexit really is the factor here that's making it harder for the UK to recover and to grow in the years ahead as well. And the OBR's forecast on all this as well factors Brexit in as well as an impact on growth and as an impact on the economy. And it really is quite frustrating in a lot of ways that not only are the government talking up Brexit, but the Labour Party are also a Brexit party too.
Thank you very much, Nick. Right, back to Ben, because you have been struck by the fact that while many public services are facing huge pressures at the moment, some actually appear to have fared much better than others in today's announcement.
That's right, Victoria. Let's talk about the implications of the autumn statement for our public services. Now, Jeremy Hunt did top up the budgets of the NHS, schools and social care over the next couple of years. And that adds up to an extra £8.5 billion in 2024-25. But the Chancellor is sticking to the cash totals from the 2021 spending review for all other departments over the next couple of years. And the Office for Budget Responsibility says this implies a real terms cut for these departments of between £5 and £15 billion, depending on how inflation turns out and what measure of inflation is used. So what are these other departments? Well, everything from the courts to the police to prisons to local government, public services that experts stress are just as overstretched as health, education and social care. And crucially, the existing cash budgets of these services are based on public sector pay bill assumptions, which now, because inflation has soared, imply big drops in real terms pay for public sector workers. So the big question, one explicitly raised by the OBR today, is whether those department cash spending plans can actually be stuck to. If the government tries to stick to them, so without topping them up, the cost could be further problems with some public service levels and that feared outbreak of strikes over pay. But aren't there still efficiencies to be achieved in our public services? For instance, the Institute for Fiscal Studies points out that there are actually 13% more doctors, 11% more nurses and 10% more clinical support staff than in 2019. Yet the NHS is treating fewer people from the waiting list than then. There's clearly a case for a focus on public sector productivity, as the Chancellor indicated in his speech. Though it should be added that most impartial experts are pretty sceptical there's much, if any, fat to trim from the public realm. But what about public services further out? Well, the implication of the Chancellor's plans today is still further austerity. How? Well, this shows how the autumn statement has cut the projected growth in spending after 2025 down from 2.5% a year under the previous plan to just 1% now. But that's still positive, isn't it? Yes, but assume departments like health and defence are protected. And this is what happens to other departments, a fall from 2.8% annual growth to a 0.7% contraction. Now, the view of experts is if that materialised, that contraction, it would constitute austerity 2.0. But will it? Well, this shows the planned timing of the autumn statement's £30 billion of spending cuts. They are in yellow here, and the £2.5 billion of tax rises, which are in blue. And you can see that the tax rises kick in immediately, but the spending cuts are mostly in later years. And here's the crucial thing. As Nick mentioned earlier, they come after the next election. That's one of the reasons many are doubtful they will actually materialise. Incidentally, the fact that these cuts, the fiscal consolidation, to use the jargon, are backdated means it's less likely that the Bank of England will slow its near-term rate of interest rate hikes. Now, that deferral of spending cuts might be welcome from the point of view of users of public services and those who work in them, but what would the implications be for the sustainability of the public finances? And don't forget, many also argue that we are still getting de facto public sector austerity in the next 2 years as a result of many departments' budgets not being adjusted up to compensate for soaring inflation. Victoria.
Thank you very much, Ben. Let's talk now to Richard Hughes, who chairs the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility. Also with us, Shreya Nanda, Chief Economist for the broadly centrist think tank, the Social Market Foundation, and columnist for the Daily Telegraph, Sherelle Jacobs. Welcome, all of you. Richard Hughes, are the decisions the Chancellor took today as a consequence of the mini-budget?
They're mostly a consequence of rising gas prices. We've seen gas prices really soar over the last few months. They're up 7 times at their peak compared to what we were used to before the pandemic. And even over the medium term, they're still up 4 times than what we're used to before the energy crisis. And so in that sense, an awful lot of what's driving the need to take these measures, to deliver a fiscal consolidation, to raise taxes, to cut spending, is the fact that this higher inflation has pushed up lots of aspects of government spending that are also linked to inflation. They've pushed up the cost of benefits. They've also put pressure on government department spending. But also what you've seen over the last few months has been a rise in interest rates, which are also being put up because central banks have to take action to bring that inflation under control. And the government's now got a debt to GDP burden of about 100% of GDP. And so that puts up pressure on the cost of servicing that debt over the long term. So much of the deterioration in the fiscal forecast that you've seen over the next 5 years is actually driven by those 2 factors: higher gas prices pushing up inflation, making pensions more expensive, making welfare more expensive, and also higher interest rates making the government's debt stock more expensive.
So the impact of the mini-budget was what?
So there was a rise in government borrowing costs in late September, and which quickly followed on from the mini-budget. And what that did is increase the government's borrowing costs, the differential between the government's borrowing costs and those of other governments, by about 1%. But by the time we put our forecast together and closed it and presented it to the Chancellor for his autumn statement, that differential had more or less disappeared.
So is it irrelevant then?
So the increase in borrowing costs, we're now back to basically the long-run average in terms of our interest rate differentials with the rest of the world. There's not really much sign of a legacy in borrowing costs for government from the mini-budget. The main legacy from the mini-budget is the fact that the Chancellor at the time scrapped the health and social care levy, so the increase in national insurance. That left £20 billion that Jeremy Hunt had to find in order to make up for that gap if he wanted to get debt falling over the medium term.
Can I just ask you about one of the fiscal rules that Jeremy Hunt outlined today? Underlying debt must fall as a percentage of GDP by the 5th year of a rolling 5-year period. I'm concentrating on the rolling 5-year period bit. Is that the same as George Osborne's rolling period he was looking at deficit reduction? This is about debt reduction, i.e. it never actually has to be met, it's just an aspiration?
I mean, it's similar in operation in that every time you move on to a budget, you roll into another year, you get another year to meet your target. And so in some sense, these are kind of mañana rules. You can always put them off meeting them. But in the end, we produce a 5-year forecast. It reflects all the decisions the government makes over the next 5 years. They've got to set policy in order to meet them in a 5-year period. But what it does mean is every time you add an extra year to our forecast, the government gets another year to meet its target. And you can see...
So it never has to actually meet them.
So it's got to keep fiscal policy settings on course to meet them in 5 years' time. But you're right, the horizon for meeting those targets is being pushed back and pushed back and pushed back.
What's the point then?
They're a guideline for making fiscal policy, and in the end, these decisions are matters for the Chancellor, not matters for us.
I know. I'm just interested. Yeah.
The Chancellor sets the exam. We just mark it.
Yeah. I want to come back to you in a moment, Richard Hughes, to talk specifically about your forecasts. Shreya, those on the highest incomes will pay the most. You must welcome that.
I mean, yeah, I do welcome the fact that the impact of the budget was mostly progressive, but from other research, we know that the poorest households are still facing the biggest rise in expenses as a percentage of their incomes. So the government could and should be doing more to make sure that the burden of this is spread fairly and that those with the broadest shoulders are paying the most.
But purely on today's measures, those on the lowest incomes will be £400 better off per year. Those on the highest incomes will be about £800-ish worse off per year.
Yes, that's right. And
you welcome that?
Yes.
What else should be done, though?
So I think the government should be doing more to ensure that the cost of this is spread fairly, so more on the redistribution side, whether that's rethinking things like the blanket transfers in terms of energy prices and things like the pension triple lock, or whether that's looking at the issue of taxes paid by the wealthiest, and then in particular things like the disproportionate burden of dealing with inflation being borne by mortgage holders, that should be spread more fairly across the economy as well.
Sherelle, what did you think the Chancellor should have done today?
I think that he should have more overtly relaxed his fiscal rules in terms of this so-called black hole of £50 billion that the government has to fill. It is a self-imposed rule.
So you don't think it exists?
I think that the government should have considered either changing the rules so that the government doesn't have to meet that target of falling GDP, debt to GDP in 3 years. It could have been pushed,
well, it did push it out to 5 years.
Yes, but I think that they could have gone further, or that they could have sort of just perhaps made more exceptions. So, for example, with infrastructure investment not being counted into that metric. And I think that we should have seen more in terms of a long-term plan, so a bit more in terms of supply side reforms, infrastructure investment, planning reform. So a lot of the kind of aggressive supply side reforms that we saw coming from the last government with Liz Truss would have liked to see more of that. But also just a broader plan of how we're going to escape this doom loop of low growth, stagnant productivity, a collapsing health service, more people on benefits. We've got 5 million people who are claiming work benefits, and they are being protected from inflation, whereas people who are working on low incomes aren't being protected from inflation. So I think that the wrong message is going out to people at the moment. In terms of crushing incentive and the desire to do something with one's life, and the desire to
the protected R&D investment and things like that today. But on your point about pushing things out further, I mean, how do you think the markets would have reacted to that? It wasn't that long ago, 8 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever it was, that we had an economic shock because of so much borrowing and no plan to tax cuts on the never never.
Yeah, I just think that, as we've heard from the OBR, we could. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, if he'd pushed it out even further, how might the markets have reacted to that?
Yeah, I mean, the markets, as we heard from the OBR, that the 10 billion premium on borrowing seems to have gone away now. So I think that there's a question about whether the government has actually swung too far the other way. So we had the Liz Truss government, which was too reckless in terms of ignoring what the markets might think of their very bold plan, but perhaps this government has swung too far to the other way and decided that they are going to actually prioritise appeasing the markets and making sure that they are happy over long-term economic growth.
Okay. A number of people, Richard Hughes, over the years have said that the OBR gets its forecasts wrong time after time. What do you say to those people?
All forecasts have errors. No forecast turns out to be precisely right. People rely on weather forecasts to plan what they're going to wear in a given week, whether they're going to carry an umbrella on a given day, but no forecaster manages to perfectly predict the rainfall on a given day or manage to predict the temperature over the course of the week. And so in that sense, no forecast is ever right. The issue is, what are your forecast errors and do you learn from them? And also, are your forecasts biased in one direction or another? In the OBR, we're very transparent about our forecasts. Every year we produce an evaluation of our forecast record. When we looked back at our forecasting record compared to when the government's economic forecast was done inside the Treasury, we have a better forecasting track record than the Treasury had when it was being done in-house. And also when you look at our forecast, when we benchmark ourselves against other independent forecasters, and if you look at the forecast that we produced today, it's basically in line with the average of independent forecasters over the medium term.
OK. Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you for coming on Newsnight tonight. Thank you. Quick look at tomorrow's front pages. The Daily Telegraph says this: the rhetoric of Osborne with the policies of Brown. I think that is a quote from Torsten Bell from the Resolution Foundation, but that's their headline. It's in inverted commas. The Guardian, from bad to worse, and a picture of Jeremy Hunt in the Commons today delivering his autumn statement. Front page of the Daily Mail. Tories soak the strivers. Biggest ever fall in living standards as recession hits. Taxes soar to the highest since the war. And the Financial Times, Hunt paves the way for years of pain. That's all from us tonight. For much more on the economy, do check out Tim Harford's Understand the Economy podcast series, which you can get right now on BBC Sounds. If you want to contact us about how you're feeling about the economy, about how you're coping with your finances, then do email us at newsnight@bbc.co.uk. I'm back tomorrow. See you then. Have a good evening.